Welcome back to the Marketing Madmen. Tripp Jobin, Nick Constantino here live with Gar Hogan of Tribute Management. We've just listened to Nick's shakedown rant, and now let's go against the wind and hear a little bit more about the intellectual property side of the music industry.
Tripp, I just love my old-time rock and roll, dude. Can you just leave me alone here?
Okay.
Wait. Something weird's going on because you just started, you name-checked the first song in my show Saturday night and the last song. Are you like looking in my stuff?
That's what we do, man. It's
that's
AI.
what it's about here.
Come on, man.
Well, look, it brings up a good point because one of the things, again, where does music go? And the standpoint of looking at it from a lawyer, you understand the complexities now of how much money they have to pay these other parties to succeed. What are they paying to Spotify? Who's taking a cut? Talk a little bit about where you see this industry going from what you saw. Let's take it from Seeger. Let's go late 60s. Let's go all the way up to today. From where it used to be playing bars and nightclubs, you build your notoriety, then you go through this small venue, large venue, you put out your CDs. Nowadays, you can literally put something on Spotify, and if you have the right presence or you catch the right algorithm, you can be, I mean, for the love of God, you just have people that are putting out content that are recording from 50 different microphones and splicing the microphones together to make music. And I'm not criticizing it because everything is music. I'm just saying that it's different from learning how to play an acoustic guitar in your basement, pissing your parents off by slamming on your drums. So where do you see the industry going from the legal standpoint, and what part do you think intellectual property will play in all that?
So I hate to be cynical, but I believe everyone knows that the currency in the world today is attention, right? And so if you're a musician, you don't have a chance. The only chance you have is to connect up in some way, get your stuff on Spotify with a global corporation or, possibly regional, national, but already has been spending decades and billions to get the attention of billions of people. Yeah, right. So where do I think the music business is going? Sadly, an artist, a writer, whatever that is, has to figure out how do they get in the flow with some multinational corporation that already has the attention.
Yeah, and I'm going to caveat one thing, right? So the problem with the algorithms, and because this is algorithm based, right? If the system realizes that there's attention being garnered, it will put your stuff higher. So that's Spotify, Google, YouTube, you name it. Okay. The problem is it is in the benefit of Google and Facebook to always change those algorithms. So when one guy hits big with that, the next guy can't, because they don't want that person to make the money. They want it to be rigged in their favor so they get the biggest cut of it all. So I think the problem is what we're doing now is we see somebody's success. Post Malone is a great example. So what happens is then there's just 84,000 Post Malones, and we have the same people just doing the same music over and over again. And that is a problem. That is not, look, I understand that when Beatlemania hit this country, that everyone wanted to be a Beatle and everyone wanted to be the Rolling Stones and everyone wanted to be Zeppelin. I get that. But they were Zeppelin by going out and finding ways to play music and bringing their own variations, not by trying to beat an algorithm. And that's the frustration for me.
So an artist today cannot fight the power. You got to go with the power. You got to find a way in. And like you're talking about, it's so complex and AI driven and all of that, you go to try to get in with the power and suddenly you can't do it that way anymore. There are people who have a pretty good idea of rationally how to do it better, right? Guys like you who really are watching carefully what big global marketing is doing. I'll shout out to my friend Logan, an organization in Nashville called HOME. But there are lots of people who can teach you how to do what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Get with the power.
Yeah.
So if your goal is to be huge and be millions, if not billions of attention, eyes on you, ears on you, you got to go with the power.
Yeah, I think one of the problems, and I completely agree with you, is that the risk-reward protocol has been turned on its ass. And what I mean is that nowadays, it's about risk. The reward is based on how big of a risk you are willing to take. The record labels lost this battle in the late 90s, early 2000s. They are not willing to take on the risk. But most musicians don't understand the time, money, and that is required to make them famous, if I throw air quotes up. So the risk-reward protocol is off. So it's the same thing with, every...
Well, it goes back to anyone can be an amateur marketer, right? So, and that's what, I can do this. I see what someone else is doing, right?
And most musicians are very creative. and they don't know the technical stuff. And it's very rare, I have to imagine, to find somebody who understands the technicality that's required, because it's not just being creative. It's technically, like, this show is worthless unless my SEO keywords aren't right, and I'm not tricking the systems to do this and that. That was the first thing that I picked up from when Tripp was doing this to when I joined a board. I joined a board like, okay, let me be the nerd that's in the background, finding what words people actually want to hear and making sure I double down on them. That's a shame, but that's the world we're in. So I think the evolution is what's going to happen. One of two things. One, people get so fed up with the machine that we go anti-machine and we go back to being homegrown music, acoustic, like music like that. And I think, look, everything goes in ebbs and flows. We had a whole time where dance music ruled the world, right? Disco was a revolt against the 80s, against hair metal and everything. We had disco was a revolt against the 60s and 70s that went into the 80s and hair metal and alternative. So everything goes in ebbs and flows. But I think it's a good point. But I also say, let's go back to the good stuff. So let's go back to touring. So we're here now to talk about Bob Seger. Okay, so you're a Bob Seger tribute band. You love Seger. So I grew up, my dad played it. I was a Q104.3 in New York, which tends to go a little bit deeper into cuts.
Cool.
And then what happened was, I started listening and finding out so many songs that I'd heard ancillarily were his. Yeah. Like from Beverly Hills Cop and just all these things that pop up, that you create this picture of a guy who, from my understanding, lays low. Not a pomp and circumstance guy, not a big guy, but a guy who got his footing by just relentlessly touring. Yep. So talk about what you know about his early days, and then let's start just hammering out some songs and some things people can listen to.
So Bob Seger grew up in Michigan. He was a blue-collar kind of guy, always lived his life respecting and promoting working people. And he started listening as a kid to radio, not in the Detroit area from those musicians, but from Southern blues and R&B. There was a radio station out of Memphis. This is true. A lot of the Detroit musicians, they didn't get it from around the Great Lakes. They got it from us.
But that's also two places with huge African-American diasporas.
Yeah, absolutely.
Memphis and Detroit are to this day, two of the biggest percentage African-Americans, which is where a lot of this music started from, right?
Yeah.
This is where a lot of it.
I mean, if you read about Keith Richards and the Stones, and I mean, there's a lot of similarities there too.
Yeah. They pulled it from the old blues.
So Bob starts, he actually was the star of a series of youth clubs, 13, 14, 15-year-old. I met somebody recently who was like, I used to go see him when I was 12 at dancing. Bob was a rocker playing when he was very young, early teens. By the time he was 19 or 20, he had a band. He was touring regionally. And he always made it about live rock and roll shows. You know, the music that he was doing, it was popular music. He was not a great writer at the beginning, but he was always writing. And he was playing really popular music from musicians who over generations had learned how to, in roadhouses, make people move and make them party and go, I had a great time.
And he was never afraid of covers, which is something I actually respect of the right musician, because sometimes like, oh no, that's beneath me. It's like, wait a second, man, you know, the world is based on covers. Everyone's covered everything. Some of the things when I got deeper into his catalogs, I started realizing, but he always had a different spin on it. It was always a different tone, a different pace, different metronome. But that is embracing. That's like you said, it's respecting the people before you also. All right, so we got that part. So talk about the timeline. So my understanding is really he started making it in the late 60s?
Yeah, he was starting to have success at touring and making money with his band. But big shows all kind of started around in 1972. He was a huge hero in Detroit. And there's a record that was made in 72 at Cobo Hall. If anybody's from that area, they know that is the temple of rock and roll. And he did a show called Live Bullet, which was his band, was Silver Bullet Band. And it became, at the time, the best-selling live rock and roll record ever.
Cool.
And that record started to gain popularity. At the same time, the music business, the record company said, you can't do it, you're crazy, you'll lose money.
Right, radio was starting to go, reduce the time, actually. They wanted those 3-4-minute songs. They were cutting it down. They didn't want the Stairways, the 8-minute long renditions. They were trying to cut back.
So he also recorded a studio album, new songs, same year. Record label said, you're crazy? He said, okay, I'll put my own money in it. Everybody in the business said, you're crazy, you're going to go broke. It didn't. It was a hit record, and the live album, suddenly everybody wanted to hear Seger. By 75, he starts having the records that we all know that just went huge on the radio throughout America. And by the 80s, he's in the canon of classic rock.
Yep.
And radio stations everywhere are playing his songs
And
from 10
you're talking
years
soft
before.
rock, you're talking classic rock,
All
you're
those.
touring CHR. I mean, the blend as a radio guy, you have certain musicians that will play cross genre,
Yeah.
and those are the ones with the most success, right?
Yeah, and he talks about in that era from the late 70s into the 80s, he began to see himself as a songwriter,
Okay.
as opposed to a guy that gets up with a guitar and his boots against the riser. He said, I really looked at the craft, and that's the era from the late 70s through the 80s where he wrote the songs that we all know.
Yeah.
And they're unbelievably powerful songs.
Yeah.
The weirdest, coolest thing about Seeger, and I didn't realize this until I started playing shows, singing his canon, he wrote songs when he was 30 years old that speak to me and everybody that I see at a Seeger show in our 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Simple storyline. I was young, I was kicking ass, I loved it, you know. Then I got older and life kicked my ass.
Yeah, right.
But now, you know, I'm older and I'm looking back and things are okay.
Yeah.
And there's half a dozen of his greatest, you know, most popular songs have that story.
Well, let's be honest. One of the problems with music today is everything's always sunshine and rainbows, and I have my cup and my beer, and I got my hot girl, and I walk around Nashville. But to understand what beauty is, you have to see ugly. To understand what greatness is, you have to see weakness. You have to be at your worst point to understand what greatness is. That is a story that I think related to it. It's a different time, right? First of all, Detroit in the 70s, let's just talk about, that was the pinnacle of the world. We were making cars. This is the world.
Yeah.
This is a different world than what it is now. But at the same time, that was the American dream. But at the same time, we had Vietnam. We started really seeing this country change. So I think they embracing the honesty and the is a
the
really big
honesty, I
point.
think, in Main Street, right?
Yeah.
Right. So Main Street, we all have, you know, dark secrets behind the curtain or behind the door, but it's Americana. We're there. I mean, it's, you know, we all promote it, but there's other factors there, right?
Yeah, well, the honesty, and that's second verse. He talks about I'm like a kid. I mean, that's one of the stories that was absolutely true about him. It was directly from his life. It wasn't Main Street. It was Ann Street in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and that was the red light district. He talks about standing outside the window looking in the club, and he presents himself as a kid, like who's not that cool. And you know, that's a lot of vulnerability for a guy of that age.
But that's also the vulnerability that most musicians have. I mean, especially you're talking the mental issues that have plagued the 70s and even the 90s musicians that I grew up with Chris Cornell and Scott Weiland and Chester Bennington. I mean, they are rock gods that can have 60,000 people, 100,000 people go nuts, and they can go home and be lonely and depressed and find their way into a bottle. So I think that vulnerability, the difference is it seems like the music was therapeutic to him in a different way because it made him introspective as opposed to the vice that just made him escape all the stuff.
And maybe the introspection and the weakness, vulnerability in the lyrics is what makes them mass popularity, because all the teenagers who are listening experience those same things.
Yeah, it's a great point. I do think that crossing genres, I mean, look, Michael Jackson wasn't Michael Jackson until he started getting played on rock stations, and that blending, and there are very few artists in canon that were able to really blend.
Right.
And to this day, you can go classic rock, you can go soft rock, you can go all these different categories, and there is a version of Seeger for it. But at its core, he didn't change stylistically. There was just less riff in the guitar. There was a little bit more acoustic. Okay, that being said.
So how do you know, going back to earlier, we were talking about how you make money, how you connect with, you know, large corporations. I mean, like a rock. I mean, I would assume that is a key part of what Seeger's...
That's how you make your residuals.
Right? I mean,
I love that story. Can I tell you the story?
Absolutely.
So
Chevy, right?
Yes, Chevy. Yeah, Chevy
around
trucks.
the time it came out, right, so probably everybody knows there was a Chevrolet truck commercial. It has a Bob Seger song. There's just a little snippet of it. The song itself is awesome. Yeah. The story is just what I said about growing up. But here's the story. It was about a year or two after Michael Jackson sold the Beatles catalog to Nike, right? Up to then, nobody in rock had ever allowed their music to be played on commercials. Oh, I want to be, you know, respect the integrity and all that. Right. So Michael does it, and there's billions are being made, and it may arguably really help Nike. A year or two after that comes the Chevy truck commercial, Bob Seger. And
Give us a year.
Can't. 81, I think.
Is it that long?
Somebody's going to correct me.
Oh my
yeah.
God, that's fine.
Well, it went for about 11 years and they took it off. The Chevy
but
campaigns.
I mean, look. First of all, I was born in '82, and that is so embedded in my memory bank. It had to be a little later. Than that.
Well, it says released in '86, so probably '91, maybe.
'86, yeah.
Yeah, so '91, maybe.
Okay. So Bob took a lot of crap for that.
Yeah.
Seeger sold out, right? Like Michael and this and that. And
wait, hold on a second. I'm not. He sold out, but he sold out to a Detroit-based company that is as Americana as there is. He didn't sell out to freaking Japanese car brand.
But within his circle,
I get it.
At the time, the creatives, everything
there's a difference
else.
between selling out with something that's completely off-brand and a Detroit-made car that is Americana. There's a big difference there.
You're a smart guy. You both are. Because here's what, a year later, Bob, who didn't hardly ever talk to the press, he certainly wasn't ever defending his songs, but he finally released one statement. He said, listen, I did not sell that song for the money. He didn't have to say I didn't need the money. This song I did it, he said, I did it for my family and my friends and my community who are American auto workers. His dad worked in the GM plant most of his life, and that's just as cool as it gets. And you got it, which is his message allied with the product in a way and the community, how the community benefited from that. He did that. Was it calculated? Is it just because he lived in Detroit? Who knows? But that then becomes this like enduring story of how message and product get
that he can stay authentic.
Yeah.
And still be commercial, so to speak.
So Seeger, what do we know about him? Just what we know from the media. But if you believe the media, I usually do, he's always stayed authentic. I think of all the biggest rock stars who never went Hollywood. Yeah. There was never a story about, with a 17-year-old somewhere. No stories about excess in some nightclub. He stayed authentic to a working class ethos that's about as American as you can get.
Yeah. Yeah, and near impossible when you're around the influences and the people you're around. So, and I think, look, he is cemented. I'm reading that he's still showing up on Billboard charts all over the place. Greatest hit albums keep going. Every time he gets reintroduced. I mean, this is the beauty of music today, is that it is easy to throw on a Spotify algorithm, say you like this song, and it pulls 50 more that are like that. So you have the discovery built in. That was a problem with music for a while. Pandora was not really good at discovery. Okay, this is where radios, and I've been a radio guy my whole life. This is where radio's lost. Radio used to be the discovery mechanism, but what happened was radio started adhering to a measurement mechanism that said songs have to be 3 minutes, you have to talk this much, so they lost all the good stuff. So what happened is people started realizing that Spotify, if utilized the right way, can open a world of these musicians, because you type in Seeger live, there's probably 300 different live things that he's put out, that he's had, that people have put out, and nowadays he makes money from all that stuff, so it works in his favor. But I listened, I grew, I've listened to a bunch before this, and I think one of the most important things is he can be the entry point for everybody is whatever they want it to be. It could be an all-out rock song. It could be a slower ballad. It could be anything. Yeah. But when you listen deeper, you get more out of the other songs also. And there are very few musicians that do that. Right? Like, coming to my head, I think Billy Joel is a great example. And that's the New York's Long Island version of Seeger. He started in clubs. You can listen to a complete rock song, and then he'll do the slowest ballad about his kid and lullaby, and you're drawn in, and then you start listening deeper, and you're uncovering all this stuff that, did he want you to uncover it? Who the hell knows? But it is very amazing that he was able to do that. With all that being said, let's talk some tunes.
So there's this really great connection that people seem surprised in the clubs when I tell the stories, but he grew up around, not like best friends, but in the same circle with Glenn Frey of the Eagles.
Yep.
And
oh my God,
Glenn Frey was a couple of years older. They played football against one another, different high schools, same city. And there's this great story that Glenn Frey tells about, I was like admiring Bob, and he was a little ahead of me and around Detroit. And I said, Bob, give me some advice. He said, get the hell out of Michigan, go to L.A. And he did, and that worked out pretty good. So you mentioned, Shakedown.
Yeah.
It was Bob's biggest, more people heard that song than ever because it was in a movie. Right. The way that happened was because a year, 3 years before.
First of all, a movie taking place in
LA?
Detroit.
Oh, well,
It starts in Detroit.
It starts
Axel
in
Foley is
Detroit.
from
Right,
Detroit. He
Detroit.
went to
Got
LA.
that.
That's the premise of all of it. But Detroit.
So the first Beverly Hills Cop, it was Glenn Frey. It is on huge record. Comes time to do the second movie, they got some guys, they want to write it, and they go to Glenn Frey and say, hey, work with it a little and do the song. And he goes, I can't, I'm sick. But you have to call my friend Bob Seger.
Wow.
Bob takes the song, adds some, sings an amazing, memorable track, writes a section of the song, and it becomes his biggest ever. We play that song. What you were talking about, different ways into Bob, that was an 80s kind of dance.
Yeah.
He never had written, but he did. It was one of his biggest hits.
Yeah.
Because of his friend Glenn Frey.
Well, see, the story behind it makes it that much cooler. Because I thought he was going to say, oh my God, I can't believe it was in this stupid movie. That's how people love him. How did that get to #1? But you know the story now, and the story makes it that much cooler because I'm also a huge Eagles guy. All right, so let's get rid of that poppy crap. Tell me about some of your favorite songs. Let's go deep in catalog. Tripp, you pull a couple of your favorite. Let me start actually because you know so. I think that Night Moves is one of the sexiest songs ever, and it probably wasn't even meant to be that. But that is like, you know, driving home after going to a game. That is one of my on rotation. Just love it. Just love the song. The way it's arranged. It's different, but it also brings out a lot of his voice, which he doesn't always have his voice brought out to the best light in the songs. That was one of the ones that was really focal point was his lyrics.
It's an incredible song to perform live because, you know, there's a great kind of medium tempo. Most of the song, the story, literally everyone I can see from the stage is singing every lyric of that song. Right. And then that comes to that middle part. I'm an actor by training, and there's these moments that aren't just music, where I can stop the entire room, take a breath, feel him breathe with me, and that waiting on the thought, right? So that's a song that probably maybe Bob's best song ever, but I can tell you absolutely.
Good for me. I didn't even plan that. That was
absolutely, it's his most popular song.
Really?
Ever. Look, so I play shows all the time. We have an app. When you walk in the room, you know, on the tables or whatever, you hit the little QR code, and you can request songs.
Cool.
Well,
good for you.
You can't request anything because we don't know every Bob Seger song, but from the ones we have, literally every single show, 7 out of 10 people request Night Moves.
Oh, wow.
It's an amazing song to perform,
cool.
really, to sing it.
What about you, Tripp?
I mean, we talked a little bit about Main Street because I think that's a little bit, there's just a lot to it. I think I'm, going back to the list, and the one I remember, granted, I'm older than you, so middle school, dance is kind of a little more mellow, but it's Fire Lake, which is kind of a, probably the early times when I heard it before I got into rock and roll. So
tell you the story about that one. You can hardly pick a Seger song. I don't know something about the backstory. First of all, it's the name of my band. Okay. Fire Lake, a tribute to Bob Seger. And, we went to do a tribute, and I'm like, well, Night Moves, well, there's a great band out of Detroit called Night Moves, and Hollywood Nights. And so anyway, we picked Fire Lake. And I said, look up, what's Fire Lake about? And Bob consistently said, it's not a place. It's an ethic. It's about a place that's kind of edgy, and you want to be there, but it's a little dangerous. That's the story behind Fire Lake. Wow. Also a fun one to sing, but it's almost country-ish in its feel.
A lot of it, a lot of it feels country-ish.
Yeah, in my band, we have a guy who plays some slide, and we treat it maybe a little more country than the record.
I grew up in North Carolina, too. So, again, the timing of it, that's, like I said, that's one I think I remember. So,
it's Americana.
It is, absolutely. So, we're going to go from Americana to some more serious topics when we come back from the break, and you've been listening to the Marketing Madmen on Extra 106.3.